If an ancient Egyptian suddenly began hearing voices, stripping naked in the middle of the marketplace, or claiming that a deceased pharaoh was controlling their right arm, nobody built an asylum or tossed them into a padded cell. Subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. Instead, the local community would calmly consult an official medical papyrus, reach the perfectly rational conclusion that a dead guy was currently squatting inside the person's heart, and immediately prescribe a precise cocktail of vulture feces, beer, and high-stakes magic rituals. In the Bronze Age Nile Valley, there was no conceptual category for what we today label as mental illness. If you were suffering from severe depression, acute psychosis, or overwhelming panic attacks, the state-sanctioned medical establishment did not view your brain as a malfunctioning organ containing a chemical imbalance. The human brain was actually considered so utterly useless by ancient Egyptian embalmers that during the mummification process, they systematically liquefied it with a bronze hook pushed through the nostrils and threw it straight into the garbage. The real seat of human intelligence, emotion, and psychological health was believed to be the heart, known as the ib, paired with the hert, the physical organ itself. If your behavior became erratic, irrational, or unmanageable, the diagnostic conclusion was simple. Your heart was either physically slipping out of alignment, or it had been hijacked by an external supernatural force. When you examine surviving medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus, copied around 1550 BC, or the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to roughly 1600 BC, you will not find a single diagnostic entry for schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or clinical depression. What you will find are incredibly specific clinical descriptions of physical symptoms that double as psychological diagnoses. The Ebers Papyrus explicitly records conditions where a patient's mind is described as being bound, drowned, or covered in darkness. In one famous passage, the physician is instructed to examine a patient whose heart is kneeling and whose thoughts are wandering like a man who is dreaming. Another section describes a condition where the patient's heart is constricted and filled with a heavy wind, causing them to exhibit sudden fits of weeping, muteness, and profound apathy. To the ancient Egyptian mind, these were not abstract emotional states. They were concrete, physical blockages within the complex internal network of body vessels, known as the metu. The metu were believed to carry blood, air, semen, and bodily fluids throughout the entire body, originating from the heart. If a traumatic event, a spiritual transgression, or an evil spirit blocked one of these channels, the fluid backed up, pressure built inside the ib, and the patient lost their mind. The primary culprits behind these catastrophic internal blockages were the miwit, the restless, unquiet dead. Ancient Egyptian religion dictated that if a person died without receiving proper burial rites, or if they had been executed for treason, their soul could not successfully navigate the underworld. Trapped between realms, these hostile spirits wandered the earth, looking for living human hosts to inhabit. A person suffering from sudden, terrifying visual hallucinations or wild, violent mood swings was not considered crazy. They were viewed as an unlucky victim of spiritual trespassing. The hostile entity was believed to enter the victim's body through the ears or nostrils, squeezing the internal vessels of the heart until the living person's personality was completely smothered. Alternatively, the wrath of hostile deities like Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of plague and fury, or Seth, the god of chaos, could descend upon an individual who broke a religious taboo. Sekhmet was believed to shoot invisible arrows of madness into the hearts of sinners, inflicting a terrifying manic delirium that drove victims into the desert. Because the boundary between physical pathology and spiritual invasion was non-existent, the line between doctor and priest was equally blurred. If your family noticed you talking to invisible entities or lying in bed for weeks staring at the mud brick ceiling, they would immediately summon a swinu, a secular, highly trained physician, or a sao, a professional magician healer. Frequently, the same person held both titles simultaneously, operating under the institutional umbrella of the Per Ankh, or the House of Life, a prestigious administrative library and medical institute attached to major Egyptian temples. The Swinu would approach your psychological crisis with cold, clinical methodology. They would take your pulse, which they explicitly recognized as the voice of the heart speaking at the extremities, feel your abdomen for abnormal stiffness, and inspect your body fluids. But if the physical examination revealed no obvious wound, poison, or broken bone, the Swenu immediately pivoted to somatic spiritual intervention. The medical treatment for a demonically possessed, psychotic heart was not gentle talking therapy. It was an aggressive, stomach-churning assault on the patient's physical senses, designed to render the human body so profoundly disgusting that any invading spirit would voluntarily abandon ship. Medical papyri from the New Kingdom contain dozens of precise recipes intended to purge the heart of demonic blockages. Doctors routinely prescribed mixtures containing the bile of specific fish, crushed flies, pig's eyes, ostrich's dung, and the burnt ashes of a pelican's beak, all dissolved in stale beer or sweet wine. The logic was completely airtight. If an evil spirit or a bitter dead soul was hiding inside your internal vessels, forcing you to ingest a liquid mixture of fermented urine and animal feces would make your internal organs so utterly repulsive that the spirit would gag and flee through your nostrils. To ensure the spirit got the message, these vile concoctions were accompanied by aggressive verbal exorcisms. The sow would stand over the thrashing, vomiting patient, reciting loud, authoritative incantations that threatened the invading demon with divine violence. The healer would invoke powerful gods like Horus or Thoth, informing the demon that if it did not immediately exit the patient's left nostril, the gods would cut off its head and feed its soul to crocodiles. Amulets crafted from faience, jasper, or carved bone, depicting protective deities like Bes, a dwarf god who warded off evil spirits with terrifying facial contortions, were strapped directly to the patient's limbs to seal the exit points. What makes this Bronze Age approach to mental distress truly extraordinary, however, is not the absurdity of its ingredients, but its profound social consequences. In modern history, society's default response to severe mental illness was isolation, institutionalization, and physical restraint, throwing sufferers into cold, damp asylums like Bedlam, chaining them to walls, or subjecting them to lobotomies. Ancient Egypt did the exact opposite. Because a mental breakdown was understood as an external attack by a demon or a god, rather than a moral failing, a personal weakness, or an inherent flaw in the victim's soul, there was zero social stigma attached to losing your mind. You were not viewed as a broken human being. You were a victim of a bad spiritual break. Consequently, ancient Egypt never built a single asylum, prison, or containment ward for the mentally ill during its 3,000-year history. Instead of being cast out of society, individuals exhibiting altered mental states were kept directly inside their households and integrated into the daily life of their villages. If a person was prone to sudden catatonic states or bizarre, rambling speeches, their family simply adapted to the condition, protecting them from physical harm while continuing to feed and clothe them. In fact, if the altered state manifested in a specific, non-violent way, society might actually elevate the person's status. Someone who consistently heard voices or experienced vivid, unprovoked trances was often viewed as possessing a porous boundary between the earthly realm and the divine world. Rather than locked away, they were brought to local shrines, where priests studied their frantic, ecstatic utterances for hidden prophecies or messages from ancestors. The line between madness and holiness was remarkably thin, and the community treated the afflicted individual with a mixture of cautious respect and duty. However, if a mentally disturbed person became dangerously violent, destruction-prone, or wildly unpredictable, the legal system stepped in with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. While they did not lock the person in a medical facility, the state held the patient's family legally and financially responsible for any property damage or physical injury the individual caused. Legal records, written on ostraca, shards of limestone used for everyday notes in the workers' village of Deir el Medina, reveal that families were dragged before local courts if a mentally unfit relative destroyed a neighbor's grain store or killed valuable livestock. The court did not punish the sick individual, but it forced the family to pay heavy fines in copper or grain, incentivizing relatives to assign a full-time family guardian to physically watch, guide, and restrain the patient inside the home. Yet, despite these domestic pressures, the core philosophy remained unshakable. The afflicted individual remained an integrated member of the human community, living, eating, and breathing alongside their family until the day they died. But as the centuries wore on and the Egyptian state faced crippling foreign invasions, the peaceful coexistence with madness began to shift toward a highly lucrative, state-sanctioned industry. By the time the late period of ancient Egypt arrived, around 664 BC, a massive economic machine had metastasized around the treatment of psychological trauma. As foreign empires battered Egypt's borders, social stability disintegrated, bringing an unprecedented surge of anxiety, PTSD, and severe depressive episodes to the population. The priesthood of the god Serapis and the deified architect Imhotep recognized an undeniable financial opportunity. Instead of relying on family guardians or foul-tasting domestic exorcism brews, the temples transformed into the world's first commercialized mental health retreats, the sleep temples. Located at major religious centers like Saqqara, Memphis, and Philae, these massive, dark-roomed stone complexes operated as ancient psychological sanatoriums designed to monetize the human subconscious. Wealthy patrons and desperate family members traveled hundreds of miles, paying exorbitant fees in silver, fine linen, and livestock just to secure a single night inside the sacred precincts. The mechanics of the treatment were as precise as they were terrifying. Upon entering the temple grounds, a patient suffering from severe melancholy, auditory hallucinations, or crippling night terrors was turned over to specialized priests known as the Kenmes, the guardians of the sanctuary. The patient was subjected to rigorous physical and psychological conditioning designed to shatter their ego and open their mind to hypnotic suggestion. They were starved for 24 hours, forced into hot, aromatic baths filled with sedating lotus oil, and compelled to listen to continuous rhythmic chanting in pitch-black subterranean corridors. To induce the necessary state of altered consciousness, the priests administered heavy doses of pharmaco-magical potions. These mixtures combined heavy palm wine or dark beer with potent botanical narcotics, including Nymphea caerulea, the blue water lily, and extracts derived from opium poppies and nightshade plants. The goal was not to cure the patient with chemistry, but to plunge them into a state of deep twilight sleep, known as incubation. The priests believed that while the body slept in total darkness, the physical heart, Ib, lowered its defenses, allowing gods like Bes or Imhotep to enter the patient's dreams and perform surgical repairs on their shattered psyche. While the patient lay hallucinating on a stone slab inside a subterranean chamber, the priests monitored them through hidden air shafts and peepholes carved into the walls. If a patient screamed out in their sleep, rambled incoherently, or experienced vivid visions, temple scribes stood outside the door, meticulously recording every word on fresh papyrus scrolls. The next morning, as the patient slowly recovered from the drug-induced stupor, they were led before the high priest for the final, most expensive phase of the treatment, dream interpretation. The priest did not offer clinical medicine. He offered dynamic behavioral therapy wrapped in divine authority. Using standardized diagnostic manuals, such as the famous Ramesside Dream Book, the priest systematically deconstructed the patient's hallucinations. If a patient dreamed of seeing a deep well, the priest declared that Set had abandoned their mind, ordering the patient to perform 3 specific daily rituals to maintain emotional stability. If they dreamed of looking out at a stormy Nile, it meant Sekhmet required a liquid offering to cool her rage. The brilliance of this system was its psychological efficiency.
By converting abstract, terrifying mental torment into concrete, manageable tasks, the temple restored a sense of control to the patient's life, creating a powerful placebo effect that frequently alleviated acute anxiety and psychosomatic paralysis.
The financial success of the sleep temples was staggering, generating vast wealth that rivaled the royal treasury. However, the system hid a dark economic reality. For the impoverished peasants of the Nile Valley, the sleep temples were entirely out of reach. A single night of incubation and interpretation could cost equivalent to 6 months of a worker's wages. Poor Egyptians who suffered from severe psychosis, schizophrenia, or manic episodes were forced to rely on lower-tier, street-level magic workers who hawked cheap papyrus amulets on temple steps. These amulets, inscribed with protective spells against evil spirits, mewit, were tied around the wrists or necks of suffering family members. When the cheap amulets inevitably failed to cure severe chemical imbalances, families were left with no choice but to fall back on physical restraint within their own mud brick homes, binding violent relatives with rope or wooden stocks to prevent them from destroying local property. The Egyptian state maintained a strict, cold detachment from the poor. As long as a mentally ill person did not threaten public order or tax collection, the government refused to spend a single copper deben on their care.
Despite its obvious commercial motives and supernatural framework, the ancient Egyptian approach to mental health laid a surprisingly durable foundation for modern medicine. When the Greeks conquered Egypt under Alexander the Great in 332 BC, Greek scholars and physicians were mesmerized by the operations of the sleep temples. Hippocrates, Galen, and the founders of the Alexandrian Medical School studied the somatic theories of the Egyptian papyri. They took the Egyptian concept of physical channels, metu, carrying life forces and emotional states through the body, and translated it into the classical theory of the 4 humors: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood.
The Egyptian idea that mental illness was caused by physical blockages in the heart mutated into the Greco-Roman belief that an excess of black bile caused melancholy and madness. The sleep temples themselves were directly copied by the Greeks, who converted them into Asclepia, healing sanctuaries dedicated to the god Asclepius, where dream incubation remained a dominant form of psychotherapy for centuries throughout the Mediterranean world. Ultimately, the ancient Egyptians approached the chaotic realm of the human mind with the same pragmatic, relentless bureaucracy they applied to farming, construction, and war. They did not understand the central nervous system, neurotransmitters, or genetic predispositions, viewing the brain as nothing more than useless cranial filler to be hooked out through the nostrils and discarded during mummification. They attributed schizophrenia to angry ghosts and severe depression to a dry, overheating heart. Yet, in their absolute refusal to demonize, isolate, or lock away the mentally ill in brutal institutions, they created a system of care that was remarkably humane compared to the horrors that followed in later centuries. They viewed mental breakdown not as a personal moral failing or a crime against society, but as a temporary, unfortunate disruption in the cosmic order, a spiritual tax paid by an innocent human being. While European nations in the 18th and 19th centuries were chaining the mentally ill to damp basement walls in overcrowded asylums, ancient Egyptians were sitting beside their afflicted family members, feeding them beer-laced sedatives, tying protective amulets around their necks, and patiently listening to their hallucinations, waiting for the gods to restore peace to their hearts.